Hello and welcome to this video on how World War II gave us better and more useful weather forecasting. Fallout gets a lot of flack for the quote that goes,
War. War never changes.
Despite this war meme-worthy quote, a war has changed and changed a lot over time. While not quite yet at the level of mobile armoured battlesuits and giant mutants, we are getting ever closer. More significant is the effect of knowing the weather. This is something that has always and will likely always continue to have some effect on warfare. It's just not going to change. Sure, we may not need to worry about rain, mist or humidity making powder or matches and fuses ineffective, but it will affect basic things like vision, terrain, traverse and more. Between these two very big extremes of always relevant and not relevant at all, there is a very basic and very obvious valley in which it will be applicable, but applicable in different ways and certainly to a different extent, and certainly how we handle it. It's a deep valley of significant but not obvious things. This brings us to World War II, a time when massive changes were happening that brought weather into the forefront of attention in all kinds of new and exciting ways. Obvious examples are the previously mentioned things like visibility. If you can't see the enemy, you can't shoot the enemy, but you can fire excessive quantities of high explosive artillery at them. In other cases, high winds, storms and rain can prevent paratroopers from deploying, unless you really want to waste soldiers and equipment in the name of the God Emperor. We also have things like tides, tidal ebb and flow, the moon waxing and waning, or wave height that play into the contested amphibious landings of soldiers such as D-Day, or even just ships at sea by itself. This brings us to the very obvious ways that World War II and how weather forecasting became very closely intertwined. This applied not just to the Allies in the obvious context of things like D-Day or the Atlantic shipping lanes, but also to the Axis powers and to Imperial Japan. The best recognised, but perhaps not by name example, is what's called the North Atlantic Weather War. This is a very grandiose name for a fight for weather data between the Allies and Axis powers. To start with, you need to understand the basics of what this war was about: data. What they had were land, sea and air data collection. This was done either on ships, in very large aeroplanes, or just in weather stations. Now, we'll go through each of these in greater detail, but more or less what they needed was each of these to get data and then send it back to a central location where it could be analysed, and this would allow, at least in theory, for each of those powers to decide what, where and how to deal with things. For example, where to send certain convoys to try and avoid the worst weather, where to and how to deploy soldiers, for example paratroopers, in order to not have them all die in the sky or crash land into the ground. The key though is that you had a variety of data sources. Now, in terms of the sea-based data sources, we didn't actually have anything stationary. Those stations were very not stationary. But instead, they were in ships or in some cases aircraft equipped with sensitive equipment and, well, in the case of American aircraft, in excess of 50 caliber machine guns for that extra DACA. In terms of what you actually had on these ships were a bunch of Weather Bureau personnel in the case of Americans, and they were assigned to these ships, admittedly on a voluntary basis, to take weather observations. Now, this is going to be things like wind speed, the use of pilot balloons, to get radio sondes, and more to get what exactly the weather is in their location. This is particularly important because if you can understand what the weather's like on a series of points, you have a good idea about what's going to happen next. And of course, this wasn't just valuable at the time. The operations that were collecting this data continued well after the war, and for very good reason. They were so damn useful for everybody. In fact, there was an international agreement that came into effect in 1946 that had no fewer than 13 such vessels run by America, another 5 by Great Britain, and 2 more by Brazil, just to be able to collect the data after World War II came to an end. And as mentioned, this wasn't just an Allied thing. Germany had the same thing, but unfortunately their attempts were rather less successful, let's say. What they did was they'd send out their, in most cases, after a very short period of unsuccessful U-boat activity, fishing ships equipped with all this equipment, and that would then send back codes via Enigma to Germany. But because by this point the Allies had cracked the Enigma code, they were really just providing data to the Allies on top of what the Allies were already collecting. In terms of aircraft, well, we have something like a large Boeing B-17s sent out with a whole bunch of equipment, but they would send them out in what is essentially a ladder. They go from roughly 15 meters up to 5,500 meters at certain points along their patrol, and at this time, they would record the weather. Now, these flights were not simple, nor were they short. They often went up to about 12 hours in length, and so they were collecting not just lots of data, but for a long time. Land stations, though, were a bit different, and in many ways you could say that where the Allies relied very much on aircraft and vessels, Germany relied far more on their land-based stations, and that's mostly because they didn't have much of a choice in the matter. Anything that was on the ocean, or flying over the ocean, had a good chance of being sunk. Because of this, the Germans had a lot more weather stations built on land. The Allies did, however, have some, and what they had advantage of was where they had these weather stations. Essentially, the Allies had them all the way from near, if not in Canada, right through to Great Britain, meaning the entirety of the North Atlantic Ocean could be monitored and reported on. This gave them a lot more information, especially since a lot of the weather patterns would travel west to east. This meant that every time the Allies looked at it, they could know if this is occurring over in Canada, there's a good chance it would travel over through to Europe. But further to that, there was a lot of them. This meant, basically from north to south, they got a lot of data. Germany, on the other hand, had not just impermanent, as in temporary encampments set up for this, but also relatively sporadic encampments, as they had to be continuously mobile to avoid detection, and because of this they basically couldn't reliably predict what was going to happen. Anything they could predict accurately was more to luck than it was actual effort and planning. In practice, well, we can see how this played out in a lot of the major battles that occurred. Things like the Normandy landings, particularly paratroopers, are obvious, but Market Garden's another example where deploying paratroopers had to be delayed because of bad weather on multiple occasions. But Battle of the Bulge was the same thing. The Allies could not send up fighters, bombers, and ground attack aircraft simply because the weather did not allow for it. But then again, neither could the Germans, so take that as you will. But also knowing that if you're going to mount an attack at a certain time, well, roads have to be traversable. So having tanks, particularly tanks with tracks, well, they can work on most icy ground, to some extent, but other vehicles can't. And so this told, initially at least, the Germans when and how to attack, but later on it told the Allies that this is when it's safe to counterattack. In terms of the Battle of the Bulge, you have the Americans unable to supply Bastogne, simply because they couldn't get air support over there to drop ammunition, food supplies, medical supplies, or anything else. The poor bastards located in Bastogne just had to hold out until they could be relieved. The Aleutian Islands, which was a territory originally American, but taken by the Japanese before they retreated, and nobody ever knew it had actually happened until they were retaken in 1943. These islands were, well, for the most part, ignored because it was so hard to retake them. Essentially, the oceanic conditions at the time made it impossible to do so. Even today, we see something similar to Taiwan. Taiwan can't be invaded by China, or West Taiwan, depending on how you want to look at it, except for certain times of the year where the ocean allows for mass transit of soldiers across the strait. Outside of that, you're just going to take way too many casualties and you'll never get a solid bridgehead on Taiwanese soil if you're China. This basically means Taiwan knows that if they're going to be attacked, there are certain times of the year they need to worry about. Even when looking to attack or defend, things like frostbite are another major consideration. The soldiers without limbs can't fight, and soldiers with frozen limbs can't fight very well, so understanding what the weather was going to be like will very much dictate when and how you do something. This happened in 1944 with the Allied invasion of the Philippines. The assault called Typhoon Cobra basically almost failed because most of the ships involved had bad information about the weather, They went straight into a typhoon that they thought they could get through without any issue, and it turns out, no. Because of this, 3 destroyers were sunk, 9 other ships were so badly damaged, and just about every airplane that was on the deck of aircraft carriers was lost, leading to hundreds of soldiers dying because of bad information about the weather. This brings us sort of towards the end of World War II, where we really do have a much better understanding of what's happening with meteorology and some of the major advances that have occurred. First of all, we now have weather stations and data collection over a vast portion of the globe. Part of that is simply that the military invested incredibly heavily, not just in the infrastructure, but also in the training and knowledge required to use this, whether it's research, technology, or even just basic understanding. All of this was necessary, but one of the biggest that we continue to see used today is radar. At the time, this was for the most part a top secret, but it became so damn important to meteorology that, yeah, it's now something you will turn on the weather channel and you will see something like cloud fronts, and they'll detect them using radar, or sometimes satellite imaging, but at least in terms of the end of World War II, we're talking radar. What it does is it will tell you the presence, the direction, and the speed of things like clouds and wind. On top of all that, there's actually a lot of math that went into this, particularly when we talk about things like trying to predict the trend. And we can thank, oddly enough, Norwegians, who are famous for their seafaring and Viking behaviour, for being able to predict the weather as well as we do. And that's because they actually went to a lot of work and put in a lot of time and effort to be able to develop great systems that predict what's going to happen and, for the most part, what's likely to happen with regards to the weather. Their work, rather than looking at the localized phenomena, essentially, is there going to be a rain cloud here, or will there be high wind, instead looked at more global, overall trends. And this meant that they could tell you more about, even if something's happening over here, what effect will it have over there. The work that was put into that then plays hugely into our understanding of thunderstorms and tornadoes as they are today. In fact, speaking of thunderstorms, it is the Thunderstorm Project which is perhaps one of the more, let's say, significant results. It's a collaboration between the Weather Bureau in America, the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, and NASA's predecessor. All of these working together to try and use all of these resources that have been built up separately, whether it's airplanes with these particular weather instruments to understand what's going on, the various facilities that were out there, and all this data that's being collected and putting it all into one place, along with the radar results, to understand what was going to happen and where, and importantly, be able to visualize in a way that humans could actually understand. Sure, a radar operator might be able to look at a weather front and know what they're seeing, but to the layperson, it's just a weird blob. They don't know what it is or what it means. Over 2 years, the Thunderstorm Project not just built on this knowledge base, but by sending pilots up into various storms in, admittedly, very risky aircraft, they could understand how storms develop and what these various fronts that you would see in terms of the weather on the news actually mean. And those results then play through into our understanding of how storms have a life cycle, for example. This is how, for the most part, World War II, although to an extent World War I, helped to greatly advance meteorology. It's the necessity of understanding weather and the implications it has, not just locally, but over large regions such as the European or Pacific theatre, and the investment in all the required things to make this happen, that we can now appreciate today in our understanding of what's going on and the ability to predict the weather, not just for today or tomorrow, but weeks in advance in some cases. A lot of the developments that were purely dedicated to war, like radar, have since been put into more civilian or, let's say, non-combat related activities, like predicting weather fronts. Admittedly, it's perhaps not as obvious as, say, blood typing or blood transfusion technology, or other things like anesthesia, but it is still a fairly major and significant thing that we have to look at as an everyday result and something we have to appreciate every day as a result of war. A war may not be good for much, but it certainly has brought us some great benefits. It's just a matter of teasing out what they are. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.